When for the second time you find yourself defending your country's way of life, you have a greater appreciation of what makes it worth fighting for, namely, the freedom to strive for the ideal of the virtuous American life, one of responsibility, hard work, and self-reliance. The collective pride people felt in being American, at least for a time, made them more willing to set aside their differences and work together for the sake of the country. It was known as the era of good feelings. I'm Anne Grace Evans, and this is a practical guide to American history. As high as everyone was riding after the war, it did expose a sobering weakness. As much as Americans might want to claim it as one of their virtues, they were still largely not self-reliant. In an effort to have more things made in America, to truly establish American industry, Henry Clay proposed the American system. This system would have three parts. The first were protectionist duties, or tariffs. The second was a robust central bank in the Bank of the United States. And the third was a federally funded infrastructure system. Tariffs are something we've already seen. From the beginning, Congress had instituted tariffs on certain goods at the insistence of the merchant population, who were worried about the market being flooded with cheap foreign goods. Then there were the Embargo and Non-Importation Acts in the lead-up to the War of 1812, which had spurred the creation of new industries to fill the void left by English and French goods. These acts had proved that import duties could be used to create breathing room for American craftsmen and entrepreneurs to establish themselves. If deployed properly, champions of American business believed that tariffs could allow all sorts of homegrown industries to grow and thrive. But tariffs were not without controversy. For one, farmers didn't like them. When it comes to tariffs, other countries tend to retaliate by instituting their own tariffs. Part of the allure of North America as a place to plant colonies was that it provided lots of arable land to grow agricultural products. America was a cornucopia, providing grain for hungry European armies and indigo for dyeing cloth. It had been convenient for other countries to do business with American farmers, who had an abundance of raw goods that weren't necessarily readily available in Europe. But they were by no means the only source. If retaliatory tariffs made it too expensive to buy American, foreign markets would just look elsewhere. The Bank of the United States is also not without its critics. Since the beginning, it had been a hard sell for Alexander Hamilton, forcing him to trade his Democratic-Republican opponents, the site of the nation's capital, just to get it formed. A central bank has a lot of power. It sets monetary policy and interest rates for the entire country, meaning that every financial decision you or your family makes is touched by what the central bank decides. And that's naturally bound to create some resentments. But one governing monetary policy is necessary to create a steady and reliable playing field, the kind that allows investors to feel confident enough to invest. And investment is crucial to industrialists and entrepreneurs looking to expand and grow their businesses. You would think that investment in infrastructure would be the one uncontroversial measure of the American system. Yet not everyone was so keen on accepting money from the federal government for these projects, no matter how beneficial they might turn out to be. Better roads were certainly a necessity for better communication and ease of travel, but the movement of large amounts of goods required better access to waterways and ports, and for this, states needed to dig more canals. The Erie Canal, which carried freight from the Hudson River and New York City westward, and vice versa, really set off the canal craze. It took 8 years of grueling work to cut its path through the marshes and swamps of New York, but it recouped the entire cost of its construction in its first year of tolls. Furthermore, it cut transportation time by 2/3. Suddenly, public-private partnerships developed everywhere to fund canal projects, but often the state would have to step in to cover much of the cost. Yet canals needed to be built to connect the far-flung markets of the United States to navigable bodies of water. Coal, in particular, was one vital item that needed to be transported in bulk. Coal had come to be recognized as a valuable fuel source, with miners doubling their production of it in 1813 and tripling it in 1818. Not only could coal be used to fire the earliest steamboats that navigated canals, it was being adopted by Americans as a more efficient means of cooking and heating than wood, and it represented one of the most exciting aspects of the dawn of the 19th century, man's desire to harness energy. Benjamin Franklin, ahead of his time, had documented the phenomenon of electricity with his key and kite experiment. Now people were wondering how they could use the potential energy stored in nature to power and make daily tasks more efficient. Watermill factories were one example of an energy-efficient innovation. As mentioned before, the watermill itself had been around for centuries at this point, but the factory, that was something new. Attaching a water wheel to a grindstone to mill flour was not so different from attaching it to wheels that spun yarn or thread from raw fiber. In the north of England, great fortunes were being made from spinning, weaving, and dyeing textiles more quickly and efficiently, thanks to the power of rivers. Textile mills were considered so integral to the British economy that plans for their machinery were not allowed to leave the country. Remember Samuel Slater, our earlier immigrant example? The fact that he was able to steal English factory plans and smuggle them to Rhode Island made him a very wealthy man. Another American named Francis Cabot Lowell had also observed the industriousness and efficiency of these new factories while visiting Lancashire and brought the concept back to Massachusetts, relying solely on his memory of the designs. He and his brothers-in-law opened the Boston Manufacturing Company in Waltham in 1814. But their greatest innovation was integrating the entire process under one roof. Part of the building would employ machines to spin fiber into thread. Another would house mechanical weaving looms. And elsewhere they would dye and configure the finished fabrics, cutting out the middleman and making the production, and therefore the price, of textiles way cheaper. One of the first businesses to benefit from cheaper and more readily accessible cloth was Brooks Brothers. Brooks Brothers, or H&DH Brooks & Co., as it was initially called, was established in 1818 to make and deal only in merchandise of the finest body. By 1820, men's style was beginning to change drastically, with most men abandoning knee breeches in favor of trousers. Located in Manhattan, Brooks Institution was certainly outfitting the Beau Brummel-style dandies, the new class of gentlemen who were interested in making their fortunes through industry and trade, maybe hoping their success might provide a good entry point into politics. And the beautiful thing about America is that these men could come from anywhere. One such man was John Jacob Astor. The son of a butcher, Astor immigrated to America from Germany in 1783. Seeing an opportunity and seizing it, he established his own firm, the American Fur Company, for the import and export of furs from French Canada, bypassing the London-based Hudson's Bay Company. He compounded his success in the fur trade by speculating in New York real estate, a smart move since the city was quickly expanding as America's financial capital. Plans for the city to eventually expand across the whole island of Manhattan were being made, and land was being parceled out to form the layout of the city as it mostly appears today. Yes, the little country had ambitious goals for itself. It just needed to figure out the best way to bring them about. Which brings us back to the topic of tariffs. On the one hand, men like John Jacob Astor and Samuel Slater represented an exciting future, one which Congress could aid by taxing imports, a tax that could be used as a source of revenue to fund further internal improvements, like canals and roads for moving their merchandise. Astor's fur trading empire definitely benefited from Congress barring international firms, like Hudson's Bay Company, from dealing within the United States. What's really interesting about Congress's protectionism is that they really seem to recognize that this was the direction the future was headed: industrialization. Most of human history up to this point has been characterized by agriculture. The labor required to produce the amount of food necessary to sustain civilization was so great that most people had to be involved in the growing, harvesting, and transportation of it. But things were changing. Mechanization, like the horse rake, which allowed farmers to quickly gather and bale crops, and the mechanical thresher, which could be powered by a mill's water wheel, cut the time and labor needed, meaning now people could find other methods for earning their daily bread. In previous centuries, options for the working class were usually to work someone else's land as a laborer, or to go into service in the house of some lord or member of the landed gentry. Both forms of employment tended to require people to live in rural settings, and both didn't afford the worker much control over their own destiny. But now the same forces of mechanization that let people step away from the plow, confident in the knowledge that others could provide enough affordable food, also allowed them to step into new opportunities. Men and single women going to work as machinists in northern mills enjoyed greater freedom in choosing their situations. If one mill didn't pay a satisfactory wage, they could take their skills elsewhere. As the mill industry attracted immigrants and poor agricultural laborers, they could expand their operations, which in turn would require more labor, more innovation. Consequently, there was no shortage of jobs to go around. Francis Cabot Lowell's name became famous as a byword for this societal shift because the community he founded for his workers, Lowell, Massachusetts, was representative of the living conditions of the new American working class. A planned community along the Merrimack River, designed primarily for the purpose of producing textiles. But as it attracted entire families, relocating for the opportunities that the mills offered, Lowell started absorbing more land from surrounding communities to meet the needs of its growing population. Not only were there opportunities for people who were looking to work in the textile mills, there were positions working the canals and transporting raw and finished products, as well as catering to the needs of all the newcomers, tailors and general store proprietors and apothecaries. Communities like Lowell, built around locks, and other industrial hubs, were attracting greater numbers of people as the United States population had increased at a rate of about 1/3 from 1810 to 1820. In 1820, the manufacturing sector was predominantly skilled artisans. By 1830, it was dominated by unskilled factory workers. No wonder Congress was taking notice. On the other hand, in the great protectionist debate, what had really made America so poised to be independent in the first place was the internal access to abundant natural resources. What one region lacked, another could provide, and vice versa. This reasoning was identical to that used by Alexander Hamilton in Farmer Refuted. America had everything it needed to become an economic powerhouse on its own. Always a forward thinker, I think he'd be pleased that he's become a pop culture icon. But his ideas about growth and prosperity presuppose that, while progress would lead to further industrialization, there would always be a solid agricultural base to provide raw materials. And in the early 19th century, the majority of Americans didn't live in cities. Most families lived in small rural communities, where their labor went, either directly or indirectly, towards agricultural production. Farmers were still very much the backbone of America, and as a general rule, they didn't like tariffs. Because while revenue from tariffs went towards the construction of canals that would speed their product to market, some of those markets in foreign countries were threatened by the introduction of retaliatory tariffs. So Congress was faced with a problem, the same that had plagued Hamilton and Jefferson's working relationship. Whose benefit does the government work for? Was it the farmers? those who kept their heads down and whose diligent work towards their individual goals contributed to a stronger whole? Or was it the innovators, the people who bet on new technologies to revolutionize industries and change the face of the nation for everyone? If, as in the case of tariffs, both groups couldn't have it their way, who should get precedence? Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Up to this point, we've been left largely with an idyllic picture of a pre-technology utopia where Americans live in harmony with the land, sowing democracy, and reaping the benefits. Of course, this rosy image obscures some harsh realities, such as how that land had been acquired and who was actually working much of it. But in the 1820s, for many immigrants seeking a more prosperous future, America offered a harmonious balance of opportunities. The due process that the Constitution provided made people secure in their property ownership. And with this guarantee, they could invest in the main commodity of the day, textiles. Cotton's versatility as a fabric made it the best choice to clothe the nation. So as a farmer looking to expand beyond growing crops for himself and his family, cotton would be the smart play. Those not inclined toward an agricultural life could find employment in one of the factories that took this raw cotton and transformed it into cloth. The men with the vision and the men with the money raised the funds to create this world. The one where the raw goods could flow from the fields to the factories and back again as finished products. They put up the capital to build and expand the watermills and dig the canals that connected America's rivers and waterways. And the government aided all of it by creating as level a playing field as they could. If you know anything about economics, it's probably the term laissez-faire, which is French for let it be. In this theory, that's the government's role in the economy, just to let it be. Given the history of America thus far, you might guess that the general attitude toward government involvement might be butt out. But that's not entirely the case. What Americans really wanted wasn't so much to be left to their own devices, as to be given a fighting chance to succeed by their government. Since the first Congress in 1789, merchants had expressed the need to have their industries bolstered by tariffs. The Tariff of 1816, or the Dallas Tariff, was passed to raise the price of foreign imports across the board, especially textiles, to give American-made products more of a fair shot. It had certainly done wonders for the furniture and pottery industries, which, since the disruptions around the War of 1812, had grown stronger and more distinctly American. It might be expected that the farmers would object to this tariff, but actually, in this instance, they were on board. John C. Calhoun, the loudest voice supporting Southern agricultural interests, recognized that in the grand scope of American industry, what was best for the textile manufacturing sector would be good for everyone, saying, "When our manufacturers are grown to a certain perfection, as they soon will under the fostering care of government, the farmer will find a ready market for his surplus produce, and what is almost of equal consequence, a certain and cheap supply of all his wants. His prosperity will diffuse itself to every class in the community." In the optimistic environment of the 1820s, even the rural sector could recognize that Congress had a duty to create a space in which to do business. Just as long as, like Calhoun, everyone recognized the symbiotic relationship between urban and rural, industrial and agricultural, whatever tensions there were could be overcome. If the economic concerns of the young nation remained basic enough, maybe then no one would notice the cracks and the rot underneath. Do things change overnight, or is it a slow creeping? In 1820s and 1830s America, there was a sense that the country was on the cusp of great change, especially with the coming realization that steam power could be quite significant. The basic idea for the steam engine was invented in 1712. It's a fairly simple concept. Atmospheric pressure, caused by the introduction of steam, which you could get just by heating up water, would cause a piston to move up and down, and you could attach this piston to really anything that required automatic motion. Its first application had been for pumping water out of coal mines, but the same principle could very easily power much more sophisticated machinery, anything that needed to be moved, theoretically. Oliver Evans had established the Pittsburgh Steam Engine Company in 1811 with that aim in mind. Steam had already been employed in the canal steamboat, first demonstrated in 1807 by Robert Fulton. The steamboat didn't require wind, could move upstream, and generally made the process of transporting freight much quicker, and therefore cheaper. Imagine what future possibilities technology like that might yield. Nostalgia for a simpler, and therefore more wholesome, time that technology has made irretrievable is a powerful force. It's impossible to go back, though many will exhaust a lot of time and energy trying. The people of early 1800s America contemplated their place, who they ought to be based on the tradition they imagined they were carrying on. People looking to create a cultural tradition often focus on interpreting the past with a view to influencing the future, like George Washington did with Cincinnatus, like I'm doing right now. What were these people trying to say about the past? Artwork from this early period shows George Washington attired in ancient garb, not only conscious of the tradition of the ancient past, but actively trying to replicate it. The simple elegance of the Federalist style with all of its symmetry was morphing into a new style, the neoclassical. It mattered to Americans to array themselves in classical trappings because to them, they signaled virtue. The model of the first democracy, its idealized version, more so than its reality, had all the features America aspired to: egalitarianism, selflessness, ingenuity. America's craze for Greek design also showcased its affinity for people much nearer the present. Greece officially declared its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1821 and was instantly a cause célèbre for the Western world, especially the United States. How perfect was that? The birthplace of a democracy, following in America's footsteps towards revolution and independence. The image we choose to present on the outside so often signals to the world how we wish to be perceived. Fashionable Americans wished to telegraph their support for Greece's struggle, but beyond that, they wanted to demonstrate their own virtue. The introduction of Greek elements in architecture and decoration created a more formal aesthetic. Things were symbolically decorative and not just functional. The monumental painting, The Declaration of Independence, modeled the event of the signing on the classical scenes of old. The message was clear: we are serious people, and our endeavors are worth mythologizing. Our institutions are august because they were created by men of selflessness and virtue. At a certain point, the perception becomes more influential than the reality. The reality they were choosing to depict was that they were the new Athens, the new Rome, not just a copy, but one that improved on the original. Painter Thomas Cole, pioneer of the Hudson River School, chose the landscape of upstate New York, bucolic scenery that he feared was being threatened by industrialization, to show the glory of the American Republic, much in the same way that earlier generations of painters tried to capture the glory that was the classical world. Washington Irving wrote legendary tales of Ichabod Crane riding through the mists of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle asleep in the Catskill Mountains, only to awaken to a landscape drastically changed. Nostalgia for a simpler time is already becoming part of American mythology. Americans were confident enough in how far the country had come that they wanted their culture to declare to the world how secure they were in their identity. We are of this land, and we derive our individual and collective power from it. Things might be changing, but as long as the land provided them this identity, they could look forward to a harmonious future. It's interesting to think about the concept of land and what it would have meant to people. Did they take the more traditionally indigenous view of land, that its natural majesty is what provided sustenance to the people? Or was America the master of its destiny by imposing its will on nature and shaping the future? In the first instance, land can't ever really be owned or tamed without killing the magical spirit within it, what nurtures and inspires the people who claim it. The second view is one of optimism, that man can harness the wind, water, fire, steam, and lightning. People could be the masters of their own world. In the United States at the time, there was good cause for this optimism. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war, found itself teetering on the edge of extinction. They wouldn't even field a candidate in 1820, with the reins of government now mostly in the hands of the Democratic Republicans. There was more consensus. Madison even approved a second Bank of the United States before leaving office. Original misgivings about the bank, that it was elitist, that it was undemocratic, hadn't gone away. Rather, like the Dallas tariff, people saw the importance of consensus in the nation's economic policy. It was what one Massachusetts newspaper termed the era of good feelings. One party now encompassed a broader viewpoint. Maybe this is what it looked like to truly rise above factionalism. Maybe a spectrum of ideas could exist within one political party. In this era of harmony and optimism in the Republican experiment, Congress felt a special affinity with other independence movements, like those in Greece and South America. So any threat to these countries from their previous colonizers was seen as a threat to the United States. When Spain seemed poised for a reconquest of some of its old territories, President Monroe, in his State of the Union address, warned against any further European incursions into the Western Hemisphere. He was declaring European aims, like their slicing and dicing of territories in Vienna, to be antithetical to the cause of liberty. So they could keep their decadent ruling classes, but there would be no more of their imperialism on the American side of the Atlantic. As you can imagine, this would work much better in theory than in practice. The Monroe Doctrine implies that the Republican experiment was more utopian than it was. In reality, the cracks had already begun to show. By 1804, all northern states had emancipated their slaves, or were in the process of doing so. But there were those who felt that this was not enough. The American Colonization Society was founded in 1817 on the belief that slavery was an unconscionable evil and formerly enslaved people should be returned to Africa. This well-meaning but deeply misguided group founded the present-day country of Liberia for this purpose. The capital, Monrovia, was named for the then president. While the society enjoyed the support of many important people, and it did have some influence, it was always more of an effort to assuage former slaveholders' guilt than to actually help the enslaved. More serious abolitionists regarded it as a white supremacist ploy to simply deport black people from America. Clearly, abolitionist sentiments were gaining traction when a congressman, James Talmadge, proposed 2 anti-slavery amendments on a bill for Missouri statehood. It's possible that his main motivation was to counter the extra representation and power this would give Missouri as a slave state. Regardless of the reason, it dusted the cobwebs off this old debate. How much should enslaved people count if that extra representation was only to the added benefit of those who enslaved them? Founders knew they had built the country on a somewhat wobbly foundation when it came to slavery, hoping that at some point down the road, someone, somehow, would fix it. The obvious problem there is that it's much harder to fix a problem in the foundation when you've already built several layers on top of it. Today, we obviously recognize that slavery is wrong. Actually, much of the United States 200 years ago did too. How then to account for the tolerance of it? There were certainly those who were outspoken in their belief that slavery should not be allowed in any form. But mostly it was so pivotal to the economy. The volume of cotton production was increasing exponentially, with high demand keeping prices high, that people must have just begrudgingly accepted it as a cruel necessity of life. Or if they were far enough removed from the process, perhaps they tried not to think of it as having anything to do with them at all. And so in the spirit of continued consensus and suppressing factionalism, they compromised. It was Speaker of the House Henry Clay who did most of the heavy lifting to get the legislation through Congress. Missouri would enter the Union as a state that allowed slavery, while Maine would enter as a state that didn't. The rest of the remaining Louisiana Territory, that had yet to apply for statehood, would be divided along the 3630 parallel. In all land north of the parallel, slavery would be prohibited. An elderly Thomas Jefferson, hearing news of the compromise, said, "This is a reprieve only, not a final sentence." The good feelings were never going to last. General Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, who already had a divisive reputation, became a lightning rod for the people. They felt like they were gambling in a system that was stacked against them. For too long, to be a contributing force in politics, you needed property to have a base of influence. To cultivate such wealth and influence, though, it's necessary to have someone in a position of power who would advocate for your interests. But those in positions of power tend to care mostly for the concerns of those who share their life experiences. Not necessarily out of malice, but simply because they're not aware of how the other half lives. So people were bitter. And in Jackson, though he himself was no common man by any stretch, they felt they had finally found their advocate. So in the election of 1824, Andrew Jackson put himself forward as the man of the people, the politician who could bring some balance to Washington by curbing the power of the elites. Though he won the popular vote, no candidate reached a majority in the Electoral College. There were 4 major candidates, all from the same party, and each was able to draw on a significant base of support, completely splitting the vote. This is kind of why we don't have major third parties in this country. Of the candidates, Jackson does receive the most electoral votes with 99, but without a majority of them, that is, 51%, the Constitution dictates that the House of Representatives will decide the winner, as they had in 1800. Here's where things get tricky. Since all the candidates are members of the same party, the Democratic Republicans, you'd think that the Democratic Republican congressman would simply choose the candidate with the most electoral votes, in this case, Jackson. Only the top 3 candidates were eligible. Poor Henry Clay, who only managed 37 electoral votes, was eliminated. But in a way, this gave him an advantage since he could now serve as kingmaker, directing his supporters to back the candidate of his choice. That candidate was definitely not Andrew Jackson. When the time came for the state delegations to vote for president, they chose John Quincy Adams, son of the second president, John Adams. Soon after becoming president, John Quincy Adams made Henry Clay his Secretary of State. This immediately raised red flags. It didn't look great. To any outsider, it would appear that Clay made a backroom deal with Adams to subvert the will of the people in favor of Adams' election, and in return was rewarded with the position of Secretary of State. Supporters of Andrew Jackson were outraged, labeling this exchange the corrupt bargain, a symbol of all that was wrong with Washington, where the elites made policy without regard for the people they were meant to serve. John Quincy Adams' presidency is largely unremarkable. His ambition as president was to promote Henry Clay's American system, through a program of building. He did propose the idea for the Naval Academy and the National Astronomical Observatory, as well as his hope for a road from D.C. to New Orleans. He did extend the national road, but one item on the industrializing agenda did not go down well at all. In 1828, Congress passed a tariff that was much higher than what people were used to. It's not entirely clear that it was even supposed to pass at all. Congressman Calhoun, who by this point was coming to regret his earlier supportive position on tariffs, helped draft a bill, along with Jackson's supporters in Congress, deemed so toxic to New England industrial interests that their lack of support would kill it, allowing the president's enemies to blame the failure of the new import duty on the president's allies. But since, against expectations, it passed, suddenly both Southern farmers and Northern manufacturers came to feel the weight of what people would come to call the Tariff of Abominations. And on top of all this, John Quincy Adams could never seem to escape the long shadow of the corrupt bargain. There are historians who claim that the election of 1828 represents the beginning of modern politics. Once again, it was a showdown between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. But this time, the candidates no longer represented the same party. It's interesting how a party can encompass a spectrum of views. People often talk about a big tent, but a single wedge issue can prove the point along which the entire thing fractures. For the Democratic Republicans, that issue was Andrew Jackson. Jackson rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, but there were some people who absolutely loved him. To them, Washington was a corrupt place, and Adams and Clay and all of their supporters represented that corruption. The election quickly devolved into mudslinging and personal attacks, a game that Jackson was much better at playing than Adams. When Jackson's camp went after Adams, he was fighting on behalf of the people against the corrupt bargain. Jackson's win was a major populist victory. His inauguration featured a huge, crushing mob of ordinary people. Sophisticated society was horrified, because these people weren't the regular Washington insiders. They were made up of agricultural laborers and factory workers, the truly working class. The election of 1828 was significant for how many people were now able to vote. Most states had gotten rid of the property qualification for voting by this time, so this inauguration really did represent the beginning of a new era. Andrew Jackson is a highly controversial figure, and we'll get to all the reasons why. But for now, I'll end by looking at one of the events that demonstrated that the era of good feelings was well and truly over. It was clear that they had been fooling themselves for a while, believing that the pretty major differences that they had could be easily overlooked, as if they would simply go away. There was the one major difference in particular: the issue of slavery. And in 1831, the country was reminded of just how significant the issue remained. Nat Turner, an enslaved carpenter and preacher on a plantation in southern Virginia, rallied a large group of other enslaved workers to stage a revolt. Over the next several days, between 55 and 65 people were killed in the county of Southampton. Though the rebellion was eventually quashed, Southern slaveholders were sufficiently worried that other rebellions might follow. Of course, the status quo wasn't going to remain peaceful. Those in bondage wouldn't allow it, and equally, those reliant on slavery wouldn't just sit back while the institution was undermined. The question was, how long could America delay the inevitable? Epilogue. I used to think the era of good feelings could be a bit boring, because nothing much happens. That's obviously not true. Something is always happening. But, nothing especially dramatic or newsworthy, like a war or some giant political scandal. Since come to realize that It's the times when nothing much is happening that really everything is happening. Let me explain. A war breaks out, or some political tidal wave occurs, completely upending the status quo and taking everyone by surprise. But with the benefit of hindsight, which of course is always 2020, these things didn't come out of nowhere. The potential energy has been building for ages in every political disappointment and difference that can't be reconciled or compromised away, until it finally bursts forth in dramatic fashion. I posed a lot of questions in the body of this episode that I never answered. But the main one was, whose benefit is the government working towards? Because it can't be everybody's. A decision that might be good for one group could hurt another. The decision still has to be made anyway. Change that, in the end, will be beneficial for a majority of people, always causes discontent. People stop recognizing the world they live in, and their place in it. In a 19th century context, that means a movement away from a predominantly rural society to one where industry and cities control the political narrative. We've been feeling this for quite some time in our own day as we make the often painful transition to a post-industrial society, as the factories shut down and industries go extinct. We've also seen that there's often political consequences that go along with this. Perhaps we need our own Hudson River Society, capturing and mourning the loss of the factories and the mining towns. It would be a far more cathartic and useful process than taking that anger to the ballot box, hoping to somehow turn back time. Of course, the difference between our current anxieties about our own times and those of the past is the moral issue. That a rural society at the time was inextricably linked with slavery. It is the unavoidable elephant in the room. There is no other way to think or talk about this time period without it. It's what made the entire rural economy, and therefore also the economy of cities like New York, work. The more time went on, and the more demand for King Cotton grew, the more woven into the fabric of America it became. So the real questions to be asked are these. Are people's moral qualms about slavery something that they can overlook, choosing not to interfere in the livelihoods of others? And, if the answer is no, just how much of the economy would they be willing to disrupt to do what was right? The thing that people never seem to realize about nostalgia is that you're just nostalgic for a time when they were nostalgic for an even earlier time. So we don't appreciate how imperfect things really were, and how all those people who really seemed to have it so good were basically in our shoes. What makes America great, and what the idea of America even is, are as debated today as they ever were. But if, as some people claim, what America is boils down to its land and its traditions, we run into a problem. Because these are not things that were set down in stone from our founding. They've been constantly evolving through the years. If we take the land and tradition argument as our definition, then the America of the past would be completely different to our understanding of the nation today. In a way, I guess it is. But the reason that America is one continuous thing and not a series of discrete units is because all the different versions through the years have shared the same ideas. It's all America, from the time when it was just 13 states along the East Coast to now. Populist ideas largely come from the misconception that any change is existential, that changing anything will completely unravel the fabric of the nation. What is more difficult for people to grasp is that America has always been changing and always will be. It's why we cling to the idea of America laid out in the Constitution. It's our thread through that Minotaur's labyrinth of time. But there are some kernels of truth in the anger and frustration of populist movements. They notice that oftentimes, this change more greatly benefits the wealthy and well-connected, while the little guy is left behind. So, let's talk about tariffs. The Organization of American Historians hosts Future of the Past seminars to teach politicians about the history of policy, like tariffs. I'm not sure how well anybody listens. A tariff is instituted to protect industries from the competition of cheaper goods, flooding the market and running them out of business. And for certain more vulnerable industries, like American dairy, for example, tariffs can be very beneficial. But for most industries in today's world, they're not a good idea. I'll get into more of the why in later episodes. But for now, maybe I should talk about what people are hoping they might accomplish and why they won't do that. Tariffs aren't some magical silver bullet. When they were championed as part of the American system, they were only ever meant to serve as one part of that system. They were meant to allow besieged industries some breathing room from their budget competition, while the government implemented policies that would let these industries grow and expand and figure out how to operate more effectively against that competition. Without the second part, all the first part really does is make everything more expensive without benefiting industries and workers in the long run. And even if there were major benefits for industries due to higher tariffs, how much of that is the worker actually seeing? Again, the tariffs alone aren't pro-labor measures, not without workers leveraging their collective strength to get concessions and protections from their employers. Basically, what we're doing here, what the government is doing here, is attempting to make an environment, a playing field, that works for everyone. And there's no way that you can ever do that perfectly. You can't benefit the workers without hurting management, and vice versa. You can't institute policies that benefit cities without cutting into farmers' bottom line. Nothing we do will ever make everyone perfectly happy. And there lies the problem with Andrew Jackson's populism. He played upon people's anger, allowing himself to be guided by their personal grievances rather than the most rational course of action. To be a leader means, to an extent, to remove yourself from thinking about people as individuals. I know that sounds harsh and kind of like the opposite of democracy, but think of it like a doctor in a hospital. The doctor has to triage, to get to the root of the most life-threatening problems. Not every person is going to get seen to right away, and not every single case is going to have a happy ending. You'll do your best, but you can't make hundreds of millions of promises. Politics might work that way, but governance is utilitarian. The needs of the many outweigh those of the few. The hope at the end of the day is that every American can lead a reasonably happy life. Perhaps we won't all be millionaires, but along the way, the sacrifices we make might lend us a measure of peace in return. You have to make compromises, but you can only compromise on certain things for so long. That's for next time.